Welcome to Weird Web Radio, an explorer's guide to hidden worlds of the paranormal and occult, reality-expanding experiences, and the downright weird and bizarre. With your host, Lonnie Scott.
Hey gang, welcome back to another episode of Weird Web Radio. I am your host, Lonnie Scott. This episode features the return of a good friend of the show and a very influential voice in modern witchcraft, Jason Mankey. In fact, we joke about it in the show that we're going to call it Mankey Returns instead of Mankey Part 2. Jason's bio from his book, The Horned God of the Witches, which is available everywhere books are sold, says Jason Mankey is a third-degree Gardnerian high priest and helps run 2 witchcraft covens in the San Francisco Bay Area with his wife, Ari. He's a popular speaker at pagan and witchcraft events across North America and Great Britain, and he's been recognized by his peers as an authority on the Horned God, Wiccan history, and occult influences in rock and roll. Jason writes online at Raise the Horns on Patheos Pagan and for the print magazine Witches and Pagans. You can follow him on Instagram and Twitter at PanMankey, and there you'll find all those Black Phillip posts, but more on that later. Thank you all for tuning in. I really appreciate it. Please tell your friends and your family about Weird Web Radio. Share it if it's your favorite episode or if you just enjoy it, and stay weird out there, my friends. We are recording. Jason Mankey, welcome back to Weird Web Radio. It is awesome to have you here.
It is a pleasure to be back. I like that this episode right now is called Mankey Returns. It feels very dramatic to me.
Yeah.
like waving a cloak around. Wow, I returned.
Yeah, we could have called it Mankey Part 2.
Sounds right sometimes.
Part 2. All right. I thought we'd start off with some fun right out of the gate. I do kind of a special series once in a while. I may even throw the tag on this episode. I don't know yet. I call it Road Spirits, where I like to talk to magical people taking magical trips and about their journeys. And you, my friend, were just recently on one of those very awesome magical trips. I hope it was awesome anyway. You spent some time in Salem, Massachusetts.
I did.
How was it?
It was an awesome place. I don't know how magical it is. I mean, my wife and I have been to Stonehenge and the Acropolis now, right? I'm not sure it ranks up there, but I will say it's really cool to be in a city that embraces witchcraft, and then you see people walking around, in shirts. I'm a witch and stuff, and it's not like 5 of them. It's hundreds or thousands of them. We went in late September, and we were told it was busy, like it was Halloween season. So.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so that's really great. So that's magical in its own way, I think. People being free to be who they are.
I thought that was pretty cool. I went to Salem way back in, I want to say it was in 2007 or 8. I'm not entirely certain. But I think it's done a lot of changing since then, just based on friends who have gone and shared pictures and video. I think there's a lot more of that there than even there was over a decade ago. But that was my immediate impression of that town was, wow, they're not fucking around here. You can be who you want to be in Salem, Massachusetts.
Right. And if you work downtown there, if you live in that area, you have to embrace it, right? I mean, that's the whole foundation of the town now is witch tourism. Whoever thought that would be a thing, right? Witch tourism.
Right. Yeah. When I thought it was funny when I went, it never occurred to us when we got to Salem. Well, a couple of things happened on the way. We arrived late at night and we called to check into our hotel, and they tell us you can't check into your hotel after 11 p.m. in Salem, Massachusetts. I'm like, are you fucking kidding me?
Yeah.
So there's even a full moon, a nice little mist on the ground. Like, you couldn't have asked for a better cheesy horror novel entry to this town. And there we go. We pull over. It's like, okay, so what do we do now? So phone calls later, we end up in Danvers in some Super 8 or something. And they've got all these giant wax figures of like monsters from horror movies, Frankenstein and vampires and things like that. So that was fun. Head over to Salem the next day. And it never occurred to me that 1, Salem's on the coast before I got there. And 2, they have this amazing naval maritime piracy kind of blended history that you never hear about. And I thought, what a bummer that that's not a thing that you even know about this town.
So there was a book that came out a couple years ago. I think it was called Season of the Witch or something like that. And it was about a guy living in Salem for a month and just interviewing people there and talking about the history of the town and the tourism and all that. And so back when I was running Patheos, I got a lot of free books, and that was one of the ones that I got, and I read it. So I was ready. Like, I knew a lot about Salem just from reading that book, and I knew about the maritime history of it. And when we went, we stayed at an Airbnb. We were really just maybe 100 yards from the shore. We were pretty close to the water, which was really nice, but there were like houses in front of it. Like, you couldn't just see it, but we were really close. And one of the things I loved about Salem, though, are all those old buildings, right? I mean, as somebody who grew up in the Midwest and now lives in California, most everything is, maybe 100 years old, 150 years old. The only thing old in California, unfortunately, are the missions, and those are gross when you think about what happened in the missions.
That's true.
So to be in Salem and staying in this old neighborhood where all the houses are 200 plus years old, right? I mean, it's like really being transported in time. And I'm sure everyone there just sort of, whatever, whatever. A little Massachusetts accent or something, right? They don't care. Like, they see all that old stuff all the time. But for the rest of us, it's a pretty big deal to see all those old houses.
Yeah, that's true. I do remember being there and thinking, wow, that after a while, it reminds me of Illinois to a point. Like here in central Illinois, you can't go 100 yards without seeing a sign about Lincoln. Like Lincoln slept here, Lincoln walked here, Lincoln peed and pooped here, like Lincoln debated Douglas here, and so on and so on and so on. So you get out there, and I remember at some point I thought, you see a sign on a house or a store that says second oldest church in America, or things like that. You just see those signs everywhere, but then it occurs to you, like, they're not kidding. It really probably is. It's pretty amazing that those things are still standing. And when we were out there too, we were looking for no bullshit, we really wanted to try East Coast clam chowder. Like, this is a thing. I travel the country finding the best clam chowder. And we were in one of the metaphysical stores, and I remember asking the girl behind the counter where she recommended to go get seafood, because there was more in town than I expected. And she says, go to Finn's. It's named after Potta the fish. I thought that was pretty funny. So you and the crew out in Salem, you're out walking around doing your thing. Were you recognized?
A couple times, but not really. Usually, so I was with Thorn Mooney, who has written a couple of books. Traditional Wicca was her first book. She just had a new one come out, and I'm like, terrible names, and she's going to kill me for not. The Witch's Path is what it's called. Boom! Yeah. I remembered. All right.
That one.
Yeah. For those listening, we're recording this early on the West Coast, so it's tough.
Yeah, it's fine. We're both dealing with coffee intake right now. Yeah. Deal with this.
So I was with Thorn, which was really great, and we would walk around and we'd go to all the bookstores and look for our books because we're terrible like that, and then we take pictures like holding our books. Right? We didn't buy them, of course. We already own them, but we took pictures. And sometimes people would like, and like put two and two together. And there were a few people that I knew in town, or shop owners and stuff who knew me. So yeah, there were a few people, but most people not really. We're just. I mean, Thorn wore a striper T-shirt when we were in town. I mean, not typical witch wear.
Yeah, that would be strange, though. I would think, to a point. I mean, you're pretty well known by name anyway in the larger pagan and witchcraft community. Thorn has a very active YouTube channel. I mean, Tempest also has a YouTube channel, and easily recognizable. So, it'd be strange to walk around and be invisible in a land of so many witches.
Yeah, but I mean, a lot of people who go probably aren't witches too, right? So yeah, they're just sort of like kind of cosplaying witches, probably for the
We're going to get in trouble for that comment. Please send all your complaints and questions to weirdwebradio@gmail.com.
I'm not saying people who identify as witches are cosplaying witches. But
no, I get it.
I don't want to offend anybody. I really don't. I mean, yeah. But there were a few times, though. And so one time, I guess, Thorn went into a store, and somebody who worked there was like, oh, my God, you're Thorn Mooney. And then... And then my wife was with her, and then he was like, "Oh my God, you're you're Ari Mankey, you're Jason's wife. So my wife got recognized once, which was really cool because
That is cool.
she teaches workshops with me.
Ah, gotcha. Okay. When you're out there, did you like discover any ghosts or track down any of the haunting lore of the local community?
Felt nothing particularly supernatural while we were there.
Nothing.
No, I mean, there's some. Yeah, I didn't really feel anything particularly supernatural while we were there. We went walking at night. Nothing. Coming home from the bars. Nothing. It was just a town on the coast with a lot of witch stuff.
With a lot of witch stuff.
Maybe we could have been. I don't know. There was a time though we went to the memorial for the people that were killed in the witch trials, and the memorial's outside of downtown. It's almost in a residential neighborhood. Yeah, we were talking to some people, and it's like they don't even really like tourists coming here anymore because it's so residential. And I felt something there, and it's the spot where they think that the gallows was, where people were hung for the crime of witchcraft. And I felt something there. I mean, it just filled me with a great sadness to think about something like that. And, it's 400 years ago. It's a long time ago, but still to think that human beings treated other human beings in that sort of way really struck a chord with me. I was surprised by how much it resonated and, how much pain I felt when I was there.
Yeah, I get that. So, I mean, what was your favorite spot out there when you guys were visiting? Anything stand out?
I just liked walking around the town and stuff. I mean, the downtown with the little cobble streets and all that. I will say I was a little disappointed, though, because, I have a lot of witch stuff. So it takes a while to impress me, I guess. But, there are a lot of bookstores, and I was surprised by how many of them all had the same stock. And by the same stock, I mean 50 copies of Buckland's Big Blue Book, 30 copies of Wicca, Guide for the Solitary Practitioner. It was like nothing has changed in 30 or 40 years. And, I expected to see like lots of Three Hands Press, and sort of those smaller esoteric publishers. And really, I got like a lot of mainstream stuff, which really disappointed me. I didn't really get to add tons of books to the library. Yeah. I was hoping it would be a little bit more diverse than it was.
I get that. I have had a discussion about this with a friend of mine who owns a metaphysical kind of shop in Champaign, Urbana, Illinois. And I mean, really, it comes down to the way she talks about it. The smaller indie places that those stores can't get a hold of that stuff and sell it for a profit is basically what it comes down to.
That's true. I know that it's really difficult to get hold of. When I've seen it at festivals and stuff, it's usually very much marked up, instead of $40, which was the original price upon release, it is now $85, especially some of those traditional witchcraft books or this edition is $200 because it's hardback in rare ostrich leather, that kind of
thing. Yeah, no, I know exactly what you mean. Well, you did bring up the topic of how it was neat to be in Salem where people are so open about being witches and open about witchcraft and things of that nature. And I'd shot you a message about this in private conversation, so you might have expected this coming a little bit. What are your thoughts about people coming out publicly as witches or sharing with family and friends that they're witches? Do you think it's getting easier for that to happen than it was maybe for us 20 years ago? Or is it still something dangerous in parts of the country?
I don't know how dangerous it is. I'm sure it can be alienating. I mean, we don't really hear stories about people in the United States, being murdered for sharing spells on Instagram. I mean, it's
thank goodness.
And, there are places where people are accused of witchcraft still, where they are murdered in Africa, I know, and then some immigrants from there. And really, that's just the kind of an extreme Christianity. Anyways, I mean, I think it's easier just because witches are more in the mainstream right now. Right. And when we were doing it, it was kind of out there, but not really as out there. And now it just feels like it's a lot more common. I just think there are a lot more of us than
I agree.
And I mean, especially social media people are kind of loud about it, right? So whether you want to be exposed to it or not, you've been exposed, and I think that's can only be a good thing.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've even seen your basic Waitsmith tarot decks for sale in some of your more mainstream box stores recently, which surprises me.
Well, I mean, you go to Walmart.com, you can buy any Llewellen book that you want there, right?
No kidding.
Yeah, I think the Horn God of the Witches is there on Walmart.com, which is amazing. I think it's not going to be in the store ever, but you can buy it online.
That's fantastic.
But even then, you have mainstream publishers like Simon and Schuster and stuff, right, putting out witchcraft books now, and you see them in stores that are not metaphysical or witch stores. You see them in Urban Outfitters. You see them in little gift stores. You see them sometimes even at places like a Target or whatever. It's usually like the one book, but it's there. That's a long way. I mean, even our bestsellers from the 90s, like maybe To Ride a Silver Broomstick or something, didn't have that sort of reach.
That's true.
Yeah.
I was really stunned through most of October. The local Walmart in the magazine section had a magazine title right across the top in big white font, Witches.
Yeah.
Yeah. I thought that was great.
I remember when that came out. I think it came out like a year ago and people were talking about it. But it has like a lot of really great pictures of contemporary witches in it. It was really well done. It wasn't just the sensational stuff.
That's true. And that was nice to see. Yeah, you're right. You bring up the sensational stuff because when witches end up in the media, usually around October, it's always sort of tongue in cheek. Like, meet Jason, he's a witch. Meet his wife Ari, she's a witch, and they are different every Halloween. Don't let your kids do this,
Well, I remember when we were young, we're both in our 40s. The only real exposure to witches was Time Life Books presents Mysteries of the Unknown. Witches. And there would be a picture of Alex and Maxine Sanders naked and tied up. I mean, that was all that you got for a long time. So things are much better now than they used to be. I was in one of those witch stories for Halloween this year, and it was a writer from New Jersey who's part of like the USA Today family of newspapers. So it got picked up by USA Today. But she did her homework. She talked to Helen Berger, who is I think she's an anthropologist, but she's an academic who writes about witchcraft and the pagan communities. And she interviewed me and a few other people that I'd heard of. And it was a pretty fair and balanced story. She certainly wasn't trying to get us, which is really nice compared to 20 or 30 years ago when they did all feel sort of like gotcha stories.
Yeah, that is nice. I agree. So I've added a thing to the show. Once in a while, I scroll through your social media and try to figure out something that maybe stands out in a way that I don't see other people doing. In your case, you have an awful lot of Black Phillip posts on your Instagram. So what's the deal with Black Phillip? Why all those?
Well, you're trying to get people to like your Instagram. But I'll take my Black Phillip plushie with me and take pictures of him in weird spots. I don't know. It's fun. I do take him with me. He does sleep in my bed. My wife is not a cuddler, so sometimes I still cuddle with my Black Phillip at night.
Yeah.
It's just a little plush black goat. Not an officially licensed Black Phillip from the movie The Witch. Yeah. But if you do search on Amazon Black Phillip plushie, this is the goat that you will find. I don't know. It's just sort of fun. Like I have pictures of him gambling, which is great. I have a picture of him with the Bewitched statue in Salem. He sits on a lot of altars and various spots. That's just something fun to do. And I love the movie The Witch. So the Witch, if you haven't seen The Witch, it's sort of set in a place kind of like Salem, though very far outside of town. And they used a lot of transcripts from the witch trials and Margaret Murray's witch cult in Western Europe.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah. So the dialogue is pretty authentic as to what people would have been saying about witches. And of course it ends with a young girl selling her soul to live deliciously to Black Phillip. And I'm like, who doesn't want to live deliciously and eat lots of butter?
Very well said. Yeah. I have actually, I must confess, and if Via is listening to this, Via Hedera was on the show recently. She also mentioned this movie with great love and adoration. I've not watched it, so I guess 2 recommendations in a row I'll have to give in finally.
You should. This is the time of year, right? I mean, we're
Yeah.
past Samhain, but it's still sort of dark and bleak and all that. Especially,
Sure.
much darker earlier. Yeah, it's perfect time of year for The Witch. We went with mundane friends who like horror movies, and it's not a typical horror movie. It's just a very slow burn until the last 20 minutes, and our friends, not witches, like, what the hell was that? And I'm like, that was amazing. And they're like, what did we just watch?
That was amazing. I like it. Yeah, okay. You've talked me into it. Officially talked into it. That shall be watched soon. Now it's time to talk about your newest book, Horned God of the Witches. I thought the Black Phillip post would be a nice transition into that discussion.
Yeah. It's so weird.
So go ahead.
It doesn't feel like my newest book now because the next one's out in March. So,
wow.
It all comes very quickly. But I do love talking about the Horned God book. So, yeah.
Good deal. I could use some of that writing fervor. I'm still trying to finish the book I was writing 2 years ago.
It's a slow process.
It is. All right. So, Horned God of the Witches, the book. Why? Why do we need this book?
There really hasn't ever been a book about the Horned God. There's a few that have come close. I think there's one called Horns of Power by Sarita Diesta from Avalonia Press. There's been kind of things, but there really hasn't been just a book about the history of the Horned God as modern witches see the Horned God, along with history of classic horned and antlered deities like Cornonos and Pan. So the time was right. I've heard over the years that publishers like Llewellen were very scared of publishing a god book. When you think of witchcraft, especially sort of more religious, spiritual witchcraft, focus is always the goddess, right?
Mm-hmm.
Goddess this, goddess that. Lots of goddess books. There are not an equivalent amount of goddess books. And there was like Lord of Light and Shadow, which was a DJ Conway book, a couple of others. But I guess they never really broke through, and they were never exclusively focused on the Horned God. So this was really different, and I just felt a calling to write it. Sometimes I feel like you don't have a choice, and you have to do this. And I'd vowed I was never going to write a Horned God book for Llewellen. I tried to write one years ago. It's like 2004, 2000.
Llewellen.
Yeah. 2004, 2005, I tried to write my first book called The Horned God, and Llewellen promptly rejected it for good reason. I wasn't a very good writer back then. I didn't have the footnotes that were needed. Lots of problems with the book. So I was like, well, I'm never going to do this again. It's just too big to do. Right? I mean, the Horned God is something that is very, very ancient and old, but in some ways it's also something that's very new. There wasn't one universal Horned God in the ancient world like a lot of people today talk about the Horned God. So I was like, well, this is beyond me, and I'm not ever going to do it. And then, it was 2019, I think. Yeah, something like, maybe that. 2018, 2019. It's hard. Everything blurs together. I was in the shower, and all of a sudden I came up with this outline for this book. And it was like, oh my God, I could do it. I know what I could do it. I know how to do it. And I, ran to my computer and typed up kind of a table of contents and then sent that to Llewellen. They were like, how is this going to be different than what we rejected 15 years ago? I was like, really? Like, we're going to go back and look at that?
Like, you still have that?
Yeah. My editor had everything. She had her notes rejecting the book. She had the samples that I'd sent her. And I was like, wow. Good gods, woman.
What, do you have time to be an editor or something?
Yeah. Like, I'm a much better writer now. I have a much better grasp on these things.
Yeah. Nice.
So
when you're putting together the book, do you, and researching into the history of things, were you surprised by anything?
Absolutely, I was surprised. So, I'd been doing Horned God workshops for 25 years, maybe 25 years. So I've been researching the Horned God for a very, very long time. When I did this book, I wanted to start from scratch. I'd already written parts of a Horned God book long ago, but I was like, I'm gonna review everything again, look at it all over. And I was surprised by what I saw. And It's like 1.6% of the book. It's a very tiny percentage of the book, but in ancient Gaul, where Cernunnos was primarily worshipped, that's where all of our images of Cernunnos mostly come from. There were figures that were female with antlers on their head, found in areas where we have Cernunnos stuff. And that's really fascinating. Is it a female version of Cernunnos? Is it his wife? Is it his daughter? Right? I don't know, but it seemed to be worth commenting on. And reviewing Pan things, there were female depictions of Pan in the ancient world as well. Not particularly like super common, but common enough that they made it into the modern age from there. And so I wrote about that, and people are like, oh my God, Jason has turned the horned god into the woke horned god. How dare he? And I was like, I'm just going where the evidence goes. Here's the fucking footnote, right? I'm not making it up.
Right.
So that surprised me because, some of those materials I had looked at 15 years ago, and for whatever reason, it didn't stick in my craw. And this time it did. So, yeah, that was pretty surprising. That was maybe what surprised me the most, I think, but those kind of little things.
Very cool.
Yeah. Not the rest of it didn't really shock me, though. I'm trying to think of anything in the book that really surprised me. Sometimes I'm surprised by the amount of like Jesus stuff in traditional witchcraft. There's a lot of Bible stuff in there.
There is.
Yeah. And I'm always surprised by that because, to me, witchcraft isn't necessarily a rejection of Christianity, and certainly I think people can be Christians and witches or whatever else, but to have it there so prominently, it always surprises me, right? I'm much more someone who's inspired by pagan antiquity, not, the Book of the Watchers and Enoch. So,
the first time I heard of the Book of the Watchers, I remember thinking, wait a minute, what?
Yeah.
I'm like you. I'm much more inspired by pagan antiquity, as you say. That's an excellent way to say it. There's nothing biblical that turns me on for witchcraft, but it does for a lot of people, clearly.
Yeah, and that's great. I'm not going to say, hey, you can't do that, or that's a bad idea, but I'm always surprised when I come across it.
Yeah. So when you're writing the book, you start in a way talking about the Sorcerer. And for folks who may not have heard of that, who is that? And what is that?
The Sorcerer is a figure on a cave in France. Usually that cave is called the Cave of the Three Brothers in English. To say it's a cave isn't really fair. It's a series of caves that are interconnected. And people 15,000 years ago in that particular cave were etching on the walls, usually animals and other figures. And they were painting on those walls. If you go back deep enough, you'll find this figure who's about, I think, 2.5 feet tall, maybe 1.5 feet wide. He occupies a corner in one particular room. It's the only figure in there that is etched and painted, so it's very different. And it has the legs of a human being and the face of, it kind of looks like an owl in a way, but it has a face and it has antlers on its head. And this figure is called the Sorcerer, the first person to excavate there in the early 20th century. It's like, wow, this is a big deal because this figure is not like anything else in the cave. I'm going to call it the Sorcerer. And people say maybe it's the first horned god or a shaman. Margaret Murray and the witch cult in Western Europe said, this is the foundation for all horned god myths. So whether or not it's Pan, who had horns and not antlers, or Cornonos, separated from the Sorcerer by 13,000 years or whatever else, they all come from this particular figure. So, that's none of that's probably true. However, the figure meant something to people 15,000 years ago, and anyone who's been in that cave talks about that figure with sort of this reverential awe that it was a very big deal to see.
Have you been to that cave?
No, only about 1,000 people have ever been inside that cave. So a lot of these caves are in private hands. There are over 100 painted caves throughout Portugal, Spain, and France, and a couple of maybe other spots in Europe too, but that's where they're mostly located. The oldest is about 40,000 years ago. So the Cave of the Three Brothers is actually pretty young. But that one is very much in private hands, and only about 1,000 people have ever been inside of it, inside the cave. Yeah. If I was an author with larger stature, Maybe I could figure out a way, or maybe Discovery Plus will give me like Witchcraft Investigations, the TV show. Then maybe I could go in the cave, but it would take a lot of finagling.
Yeah.
And influence I do not have.
I tell you, one of the surprises I had reading your book, I've always been aware, I think anybody who's ever read Witchcraft books was aware to some degree of that painting in the cave. I did not know just how far back in time you were finding evidence of like antler headdresses or something of that sort in burials.
Right. There's
far before that painting.
There's there are things that are older. Not the burial headdresses are a little more modern, but there were people buried with antlers, people buried with horns. There were Neanderthals who were buried with antlers. And anytime that you give a child a pair of antlers and then put them in a grave, to me it sounds like you're suggesting that there is life in the next world, or maybe that you're going to come back, because horns are things that are continually regenerated. They fall and then come back off somebody's head. So people, the symbolism of horns resonated and goes back like 100,000 years or something. It's really crazy. You don't think about religious ideas or spiritual ideas being that old, and apparently they were. And this is even, I think, before people were speaking. Language is only 30,000 years old.
Going forward in time from there, you take the next step in the book goes to talking about Pan. And Pan is, I gather, is pretty important to your own personal work.
Never had any.
Never heard of that guy, right? So for folks who have, believe it or not, there are people out there who may not be well aware of Pan, and some may even have misconceptions about Pan. What would you like them to know?
Well, I don't really think it's hard. I think you'd have to really try to have misconceptions about Pan, because he was not a good actor. Like, if you read the mythology, this is not the most well-behaved of the gods, right? I mean, most of the stories about Pan are, hey, I would like to have sex with that nymph. I will chase them until they A, have sex with me, or B, they transform into something else as to not have sex with me, right? So not always God on his best behavior, but to me, like Pan along with Cernunnos are the two figures that have contributed the most to the modern understanding of the horned god. In ancient Greece, Pan was not a primary deity. He was very much, I would call him like a B team god. This is a god that people know. This is a god that people probably even like, but this is not a god with giant temples and cities or anything like that. Frequent motif in art, but not the kind of god that a ruler is going to identify with or something of that nature. So very much kind of a B god, though some of the things that we associate about the horned god are very Pan-like. I mean, he lived in wild spaces. He was a god of shepherds and flocks. He was very liminal in that sense, in that he liked the conveniences of cities, especially their ability to make wine. But he also didn't like people. He liked to live alone, and he liked to be out in the wilderness and stuff, which is very much like a shepherd, and didn't like people encroaching on where he lived. All of his major worship areas were several miles outside of towns. You'd walk to the Pan Grotto, leave some offerings, and then do whatever it is that Pan wanted you to do that night, which, we can probably involve what everyone thinks that it would be involved with, right? Lots of sex and stuff. There's this idea that Pan became sort of the personification of the devil, after Christians took over. Really not necessarily true. Every deity, every goddess, every god were seen as a demon. They were all bad. They were all Satan out to trick the world and things. Certainly Pan, often pictured with an erect phallus, would have come into sort of more conflict with Christians, because they really didn't like that sort of thing. But he wasn't necessarily like the poster boy for Satan or whatever. If you go back and look at prints in the early modern period and stuff, they don't usually really look like Pan. The closest that does is Robin Goodfellow, and people see that image a lot and go, oh, Pan. But Robin Goodfellow was not the devil and was a figure from folklore, and while he had the goat legs and usually a cod piece or an erect penis in art, he was specifically not Pan, and he was usually seen as a good thing and not a bad. So, Pan as the devil is not as universal as people think.
That's good to hear. In fact, I hear a lot of people talk about Pan as though Pan is the all.
In modern Greek,
the one.
in modern Greek, Pan means everything or all. Mm-hmm. But the problem is that his name doesn't come from modern Greek. His name comes from an Indo-European root word, pa, which means pasturer or shepherd. So, like, his name is tied into his very function in Greek mythology and in the Greek pantheon. But over time, though, because of that conflation with the modern Greek word, people began to think of him that way. They began to think of Pan as the god of everything or all. And they thought of him that way because they saw within Pan a divine form who lived here on the earth. So this became very popular, especially during the Renaissance, first in Italy, and then you had people like Francis Bacon writing about Pan in this similar sort of way. That, here is this figure that, maybe it doesn't look like exactly like we want it to, but if you look close enough, you can see everything within the universe in this one figure, connection to Earth, and then the horns are like antennas to heaven, that sort of thing. He plays the panpipes, which play the universal music that everybody needs to hear and things. So he did eventually really become everything or all to a lot of people.
I could see how they would make that connection. Cernunnos, you brought up Cernunnos at certain points in the discussion, his worship being mostly in the area of France or Gaul. Mm-hmm. Do you think Cernunnos might be one of the more popular versions of the horned or antlered god that we see today?
Absolutely. Cernunnos is hugely popular. I think part of it is because there are no Cernunnos myths, and all we really have are pieces of him from art from that era. There's only one written instance of the word Cornonos that we've been able to find. So because of that, he can be whatever you want him to be. Right? He's very malleable. And I think that appeals to a lot of people. But also, when people, like the first witches were writing in the 50s or 60s, there was this idea that almost everything in witchcraft and even just sort of modern paganism as a whole was Celtic. And, this was an attitude that really stayed up until the 1990s. Celtic this, Celtic that. And people were like, well, Cernunnos is the representation of the Celtic horn god. So I think that really helped his popularity in that sense. Also, Margaret Murray wrote a lot about Cernunnos in Witch Cult in Western Europe, and then the follow-up book to that, which was called God of the Witches. And she calls Cernunnos the supreme deity of Gaul, which takes a lot of gall to write that, because there were really only maybe 40, 50 different images of Cernunnos from that, area that we've been able to find so far. So it's not something he was not a figure that was extremely popular. He was a figure that, some people worshipped and things. And I think it's pretty clear that he was a god, though there are some scholars who don't even think Cernunnos was god in the ancient world. Maybe he was a chieftain of some note, and they made these images in honor of that. So he was very much sort of like Pan, a more of a minor deity. There are people today who, when they read Irish Celtic myth or Welsh mythology, they're always trying to find a deity that they think is Cernunnos. So sometimes people will say, well, this figure in this myth is Cernunnos, just with a different name. Though, and that's fine. People want to believe that. I just don't think that there's really any evidence that is absolute that really suggests such a thing.
Yeah, it is. It's one of those cases too where maybe it's great that he can become whatever the modern worshiper or witch needs that figure to be. At the same time, it always kind of saddens me when we find something in mythology, especially, that's so lost to time. The stories are gone.
That really makes me sad. One of the things I like about Cernunnos, though, is there are things that we can infer about him through the art. I mean, we know what ancient art means, and we can see the symbolism in the images of Cernunnos. So we do know some things about him. And I always find that the things that we're pretty sure we know about him from the ancient world really sort of match up well with how he's viewed today. To me, Cernunnos is a god of the living and the dead. So he's a part of this world and he's a part of the next world. And there are things about Cernunnos, like associations with gold and wealth, which is something that is mined from the ground, which has overlaps with deities like Hades or Pluto from the Greek and Roman. So, I think that links him to the dead in a way. There's also the Ream Stela, which is a really great image of Cernunnos. And he's sort of in a temple, and above him is a rat, which is a figure also associated with death. So, I mean, I think if Cernunnos is your god who is sort of liminal in between those two spaces, I think that's proven by what art that we have. But, on the Gundestrup Cauldron, which is the most impressive piece of Cornonos art, he's surrounded by animals. Mm-hmm. And we often think of Cernunnos as a god of animals or a god of the hunt. And the Gundestrup Cauldron suggests something like that. So, I think for the most part, I don't see anything that's wildly off. The only thing about Cernunnos that it really makes me sad to see, every great once in a while, I will see a Cernunnos image and he's got like a giant boner, which is very Pan-like. But there were no images of Cernunnos with giant boners in the ancient world. I mean, I'm sure he wasn't celibate, but, leave the giant phalluses for Pan and Priapus.
There you go. You start your social media campaign.
Yeah.
One of my other favorite surprises in your book was concerning Hearn the Hunter. And the reason I found it to be a pleasant surprise of sorts was because many years ago in my younger, I don't know what kind of paganisms I'm going to stick to days, and I was exploring different things. A friend of mine gets his hands on 21 Lessons of Merlin, also known to some folks as 21 Lessons of Hogwash, justifiably so. But in that book, I remember him talking about Hearn as a figure. At least that's where he seemed to have said he found it. That's where I got the first introduction to this idea. And I got very, very attached to the idea of Hearn for some reason back then, and built a practice around Hearn, and he became a very central figure to my practice for a short time. And then I move on into other things as people do. And for most of my practicing life, Odin has been an enormous figure of influence in my practice. Obviously, as a heathen, primarily, that's going to be true for me. I didn't know there was some connection between the two.
Yeah, so Hearn is a complicated deity in the sense that there's really no evidence of Hearn before 1596 when he shows up in Merry Wives of Windsor, right? Yeah. And which is a Shakespearean play. But the area of Windsor has a lot of folklore and things, and it was an area that was invaded by Vikings. So it had become a Christian area, pagan, Christian, and then the Vikings come and it's pagan again. And in the myths of Hearn, he's hung from a tree. What other deity is hung from a tree? Why? It would be Odin. So if, there's an ancient pagan predecessor to Hearn, it makes a lot more sense that it would be Odin, because there's a similarity with those myths than it would be with Cernunnos. We don't have any images of Cernunnos that have been found in Windsor Forest, though we do know that Vikings were in that area. So that makes a lot of sense. It's not an idea that I came up with. It's an idea that is in a writer named Eric Fitch, and his book is called In Search of Hearn the Hunter, which is a fabulous book if you love Hearn. There's a lot of stuff in that book. I wish I could have put it in mine, but my book was already, I thought, long enough. Yeah, but I that's to me, if there's sort of a pagan precedent for Hearn, if he has the origins in another god, I really do think it's Odin. It just makes more sense.
Yeah, I found that very, very interesting. It makes me want to start some kind of poll amongst the heathen community to see if anyone else encountered Hearn early on in their days that led them at some point, or their practice led at some point to Odin after that. I'd be interested to see if there were others who had a similar pathway.
I am always fascinated by sort of the pathways between deities. And, I'm a polytheist, but at the same time, I'm not sure I could ever be a hard polytheist just because
Right.
you see that evolution, right? You see like one deity sort of morph into another deity. And the question then becomes, oh, so, you were, you were this one deity and then you become this. Did you just kind of like birth a new deity, so to speak? Like how exactly does that work? So that those pathways are fascinating to me. And, I
Yeah.
think, maybe Hearn is an entryway for somebody to learn more about Odin or vice versa or whatever it is, because those deities have those kind of connections. I assume that deity operates in a different way than human beings,
Hmm.
and I would never suggest that I know like what deity is or how it does things, but you can see those commonalities between things.
I agree. Yeah, I'm similar. I'm polytheist, but I lean softer, and my argument for that is always, it's clear to me anyway that Woden is Woden, is Odin, is Odin, and so on.
Right.
Dunar is Thunar, is Thor, and so on. You get separations here and there, but I can see the similarities between the Greek fates and the Nordic Norns, and similar functions and practices. It's and then you get into the concept of like I do a lot of work with Hecate as well as a part of my practice, and she's got all these epithets that represent different aspects of her, or possibly even different spirits of a sort. Odin is the same way. He has all these hetes or different names, and depending on what you call, you could very likely get a different experience. So I'm like you. I'm not here to try to tell deity sized spirits what they can and can't do. Clearly, they'll do whatever the fuck they want, uh, and they're not going to give us any hard, true, definite answers either. But it's one of my favorite things to look at through time. The senior druid of my ADF grove I'm part of, and I were out just having coffee the other day, and we were in a similar discussion, and out of my mouth comes Hermanubis. Who was the first person to sell this concept, and how did it happen? And then it lasts, for a long time. Deities are very interesting this way, and the way we interact with them as a culture.
Right now, I'm doing edits for the ninth book. The Horn God is the seventh book, and
Oh
it's
man.
on the Greek gods. But one of the things about the Greek gods, which is always fascinating to me, is how they would cross over into other cultures and things. Like they never remained specifically Greek, and some of them weren't from Greece at all. They just kind of got imported and became Greek. And you can see that. I mean, there's a real paper trail, and there's
Mhm.
archaeological evidence about all these things, and I find it endlessly fascinating.
Yeah, same. I absolutely the same. Um, I want to touch on this before we get to the end of the regular portion, because I think it's an interesting phenomena unique to our particular time. Uh, the popularity of Lucifer and witchcraft today,
Yeah.
because 20 years ago,
Woo.
that wasn't so much a thing.
Yeah. I think a lot of it has to do with the popularity of traditional witchcraft, people looking at Robert Cochrane and other sources for inspiration. And as we talked about earlier in the show, those traditions did not shy away from using Christian or Jewish ideas and concepts, right? And there it is. There's Lucifer right there at the beginning. There's the devil. And you look at Margaret Murray's writings on witches in witch cult in Western Europe and the god of the witches. She said that witches worshipped a horn god who was originally this pagan deity, but had been corrupted. And now people thought he was the Christian devil, and these witches bought into that corruption and were basically worshiping him as the Christian devil. So if you are somebody who's inspired by tales of witchcraft from the early modern period, you're inspired by tales of people who are talking about worshiping the devil, right? And when you think about what those people said that they did, though, in worship of the devil, they didn't really do a whole lot of things. They got initiated. Oh, how terrible. Oh, my God. Somebody had a moving religious experience. They feasted. Oh, that sounds fun. They had orgies. Please invite me, right? I mean, they didn't. The only thing that they did that was bad is, there's talk of human sacrifice, but there's no evidence that anybody ever really did that anybody did that during that period of time. So Hell yeah. I mean, why not be inspired by that? No, as bad as they tried to make that figure look, he certainly didn't seem to be doing anything that was bad for people,
Mhm.
right? He was like, oh my God, live deliciously, going back to the witch earlier, right? That's what he's saying. So I think it's great. And Murray's books had a huge impact on how we view the Horned God today and how that figure evolved. So, when people say, well, there's nothing of the devil in the Horned God, I'm like, well, of course there is. I mean, we have this whole body of literature that talks about the Horned God being the devil. That doesn't mean that he's ruling over a land of fire and brimstone, but
Mhm.
those stories and that folklore have certainly influenced how we see the Horned God today, and have kind of brought that figure up to a place of prominence. Also, with people looking for knowledge and wisdom, that's really what Lucifer's role was: God of knowledge and wisdom. You know, God, don't angry Jehovah God, don't eat the tree so you can learn shit, right?
Yeah.
Alternative voice, eat the tree, learn that you are naked, right?
Right. It's a good point.
The alternative
Right.
voice is pretty interesting to me. That's one I would have followed.
Agreed. And same. Absolutely. I forgot what I was going to ask you at that point. It must not have been that important.
Lucifer's got your tongue, but
I guess. So this is book 7. He said book 8 is coming in March.
yes,
What's book 8?
it's called The Witch's Book of Spellcraft. And then there's like
Oh,
9 words after that I can't remember right now. But it's, I think if you're a witch writer, you have to write your magic book at some point. And this is my magic book. And I wrote it with a couple of friends who helped me with the spell work. But, it looks at the different ways witches do magic and tries to explain how that magic works, right? Like, just because you have a stone in your pocket doesn't mean that that stone has the energy to, radically transform everything in your life. So how does that work? What does it do? And, it covers stones and crystals, herbs and plants and trees and that kind of thing, candle magic, written word, creative visualization, oils and incenses. Kind of at the end, there's some more advanced magical techniques like poppets. It covers, kind of everything that witches work with to do magical spell work. Everything that's not a grimoire, basically.
right.
And then it has spells after each chapter, putting into practice the things that we just talked about in the book. I think there are over 100 spells in there, probably ideas for more, like another 200 spells. So yeah, pretty excited about that one. That
All
comes out
right.
in March, allegedly.
Allegedly.
Supply chain issues have made books come out later and later. I know some authors who were supposed to have books come out in September who didn't see their books arrive on the shelves until October because
Okay.
of everything being backed up. So we're going to hope for our best. We're going to use Witchcraft. We're going to use the techniques outlined in the Witch's Book of Spellcraft and try to make sure that book comes out on time.
Awesome. I hope everything goes well. So, well, we've come to the end of the regular portion of the show. Is there anything that you would like to talk about? Something I should have brought up that you'd like to cover?
I think you plugged both my books. I mean, what more do I need? You know, you can find Jason online pretty easily. I'm the first Jason Mankey who shows up in Google. There's a preacher. If you keep reading, like by page 4, I feel bad for that guy, but it makes me laugh. I have a Patreon with extra Jason writings and stuff if you care about that sort of thing. And I still blog periodically at Raise the Horns on Patheos Pagan.
Yeah, and there's no lack of your thoughts in the world. That is for sure. You have populated the globe with your writing and thoughts. Well done, sir.
Trying to do less of that because it seems like you just make people mad now when you share your thoughts. So.
Well, if you're not making people mad, you're probably not stating a really solid opinion. So good on you to do so.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah. All right, man. Well, thank you again for being on the show. I really appreciate that.
It's always a pleasure, sir. This is always fun.
Awesome. And for everyone listening, thank you again for being here. Thank you for listening to the show. Please share it with your family and your friends and let them know about Weird Web Radio. If you want to stick around here the rest of the conversation, you're going to have to go to patreon.com/weirdwebradio or go to weirdwebradio.com and click join the membership to get into the bonus portion of all the episodes. Thanks for tuning in, folks. Stay weird out there, my friends. And Jason, it is now bonus audio time. Are you ready?
No, I'm going to go get more coffee, and then I will be ready.
Sold.
And we are ready. Well, I am ready.
You're ready?
I should probably talk about myself in the plural. I am ready.
Jason is ready. All right. First question is always the same as a general rule around here. And you've answered it once before. What famous person's resting place would you most like to visit?
Gosh, I hope I answer it the same as I did last time, or I'm lying, I guess.
Do you want to hear how they just answered that question? What famous person's resting place would you most like to visit? That and many others, including what they think about the afterlife, what they may or may not do in cemeteries, what are their traditions, magical practices that have to do with the dead, folklore that surrounds their homes, and so much more, available for only $5. $5 a month. Even if I make more than one episode in a month, it's still just $5 a month at patreon.com/weirdwebradio or go to weirdwebradio.com and click join the membership. You can find me on Instagram at weirdwebradio. You can find me on Facebook as Weird Web Radio, or come join the new, fun, and exciting Weird Web Radio Facebook group. Thank you again for being here. Stay weird out there, my friends.